Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Now, we want to get right into what's going on in the Middle East, especially in the way that this bears on the U.S. Presidential election. As of this afternoon, in Europe, specifically Moscow time, we have talks going on between Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Kerry. And the goal of these is to institute a truce in northern Syria. And it would be an attempt to get back, in a general way, to the cessation of hostilities agreement. And you know, the perspective we have here is to essentially establish, or failing that, impose a truce on the contending parties, because none of them, nobody in this picture is an angel. But what we can do usefully and constructively is to look for a peace settlement, or at least at the moment, a ceasefire settlement. So Lavrov and Kerry are meeting. At a certain point, the UN envoy, who is responsible for this tremendous problem in the Syrian war, Stefan de Mistura comes in, and we don't really know what the conclusion is. But we do know that there is this problem now of the crowded skies over Syria. And we've talked about this before. You've got the U.S. bombing ISIS in Iraq, northern Iraq, other parts of Iraq. And you've got Russia bombing targets in Syria especially. And we've also got the Syrian Air Force, which has been active, and now, even more than ever, we've got the Turkish Air Force coming in, and there has been a request by the Russian government to the Turkish government saying, please give us information about your flight plans, because otherwise you could have the situation where Turkish and Russian planes would confront each other over Syria. And even though relations between those two countries have been improving, we don't want to have any untoward incidents. And remember, Turkey as a NATO country, no matter how crazy they act, somehow they have a hold on the United States, which I think is this is a deep, long-term problem, that we've got bad allies, right? We've got false allies. We've got treacherous allies. And this character, Erdogan in Turkey is, I think, a leading example of that. So this is the current ongoing negotiation. And it also revolves around that question of the joint integration group, meaning a coordinating center, probably located in Jordan. We have a Russian headquarters, a U.S. headquarters, and then halfway between them, under a tent or whatever they have in buildings, then that would have to set up this coordination. And the news coverage on this now says that there has been a useful cooperation between Russian and U.S. experts who are talking about maps that they have drawn up, which show where the various groups are located. But unfortunately, everybody in this entire operation is running a little bit off the reservation compared to their allies, alleged or real. So those are problematic points. For example, if the Kurds say, we're going to get into a fight with the Syrian Arab army, that doesn't help anything. The Turks, of course, are interested in seizing the town of Jarablus, which they have now done, in order to keep the Kurds out of Jarablus, and obviously, given the fact that it's Erdogan, to keep the supply line open so that logistics, recruits, money, spare parts, ammunition, fuel, as they can't find gasoline, of course, in their areas, scarcely, all of that has to come in. So the question now is Jarablus, right? And we've been talking about Jarablus, right? Chances are you heard about Jarablus for the first time in your life right here on this broadcast or in our written briefings. So the Turks have now taken over Jarablus. On the one hand, positive, ISIS is no longer there, right? The Turks can't get away with some of that stuff that ISIS has been doing, but then bad, because this is not a definitive solution to it at all. So we want to continue to press, and the Tax Wall Street Party calls on the Russian and U.S. governments to immediately set up that joint integration group so that the coordination can be done. Now, we've always noticed that the media in the U.S. were concerned mainly to cover up the reality of what Erdogan has been doing, right? That he's the main backer, patron, in some sense, commander of ISIS, right? He views ISIS as his asset, his irregular forces, right? His cavalry, whatever you want to call it, that he can project far into Syria, farther than he would want to go, I think, at the moment, at least with his Turkish army, powerful though that may be. So we had a big attempt, I think, over many months to try to hide this fact, right? What's Jarablus? What's Efren? What's Aziz? All of this stuff. What is the Jarablus corridor? How is ISIS supplied? So we had a kind of an interesting discussion on National Public Radio this morning. So we have Nadia Bilbaisi, who is Al Arabiya, and Al Arabiya means the Saudis. Okay, so she's talking about this fact that you have a stretch of land that comes from Kobane on the Syrian-Turkish border, and it goes west, it gets to Jarablus, and then it goes over to Azaz and Efren. And that, once again, is the classic 100-kilometer, 60-mile corridor through which all ISIS supplies pass and without which ISIS is doomed. And we've been celebrating here, step by step, week by week, month by month, that capture, the liberation of Manbij, which was a key crossroads in that area. That's a little bit further south, kind of beyond the Turkish ability to influence it. But let's see how far the Turks go, and do they try to interfere with the new government that has been set up under sort of U.S. auspices in Manbij. And then we've got that town Al Bab. Look, with Al Bab, this is immediately relevant to international questions, right, to the U.S. presidential election. It would be very good if the Obama White House made some kind of an effort to educate the journalists about this stuff, because the press, they just don't know. I think a lot of them don't have a clue. Some of them do know, and they've decided to play along with the news blackout. But if you look at Manbij, if you want to go southwest out of Manbij towards Aleppo, which is where the big action is taking place, or at least the siege is taking place, about halfway you get to this place called Al Bab. And what is Al Bab? It is the location of the foreign intelligence, the CIA, I guess, equivalent, MI6 equivalent, DGSE equivalent of the ISIS government. And this is now it's going to be captured soon. And I think that will have an immediate impact, especially in propaganda terms and probably also practical terms, on the ability of ISIS to project terrorism in the quest of the October surprise. Back in a minute. Welcome to World Crisis Radio. So we want to remind everybody, keep up with our new daily program, daily 1-hour program, by subscription, very modest fee, price of a cup of coffee. Gets you a month of it. And that is at americansystem.tv. please go to americansystem.tv, sign up. You can hear strategic analysis, news, background every day of the week. And we think we're filling a void which has been left by the retreat from reality of many of the websites which had since 2001, 15 years ago, had tried to at least sometimes provide an alternative to the controlled corporate media. But this is now a daily service from us, and it does offer you an alternative to the controlled corporate media. And it's an alternative which is not crazy, not paranoid, not sold out to any candidate, right? No. But rather something that is trying to develop activism. And we've expressed that activism, for example, through our call to Obama. And this is a rough call. Obama, come back from your silly vacation, call the Congress back into session, put them on the spot. Zika is spreading. We've got action going on around Zika. We've got everything except the $2 billion needed to try to stop it. It's like the federal agencies are adapting to a world with Zika. This is absolutely out of the question. So bad news. And we will offer an alternative. So that's americansystem.tv. Now, as we were saying, looking in this critical area between Jarablus on the west bank of the Euphrates River, and that stretches over to this area of Efren, Aziz, the areas north of Aleppo, the border north of Aleppo or northeast of Aleppo. That's the key area. Manbij had already been taken away from ISIS, and now the Kurds apparently have also left. They helped to liberate Manbij. But now that other area, that Al-Bab, that is critical, and it's called the Amn el-Karges, A-M-N-E-L or A-L-K-A-R-G-E-S. Big problem of transliterating Arabic. We always mention it. You're going to find many, many different spellings, right? Muammar Gaddafi was spelled, I think, 25 different ways in the transliteration into the Roman alphabet. But that is, the Amn el-Karges is the foreign intelligence. In other words, to the extent that these things are planned in ISIS land, in the caliphate, in the Islamic State, that's what goes on in El-Bab. So it's really important to clobber El-Bab. And, of course, the question of Mosul in northern Iraq. There is now motion of forces towards Mosul, and it's going to be important to conquer the enemy capital, right? Raqqa. So here's what we hear today on National Public Radio, right? This always interesting Diane Rehm show gives you the dominant line from State Department and U.S. establishment, whatever you want to call it. Biden went to Turkey. He was snubbed. He was met by low-level officials. This was an insult to the United States. We're keeping track, Erdogan. This is Erdogan, the tin pot dictator, who gives us orders that we have to extradite this guy Gülen, the anti-Erdogan opposition leader. Fine. We live with these things. But the question then is, what is Erdogan going to do? The Erdogan, the pro-Erdogan line now reflected in this program today, right? Reflected in the statements of some of the participants, is that the Erdogan people say, lucky for you, U.S., we defeated this coup on July 15th because the people who then waged the coup had been sabotaging and hampering all the wonderful things that Erdogan wanted to do against ISIS. How about that? So saying, look, you got to get your facts straight here. Erdogan is anti-ISIS, and the coup people were pro-ISIS. So I would not believe this, but that is what is on the table. The headlines have been Turkey enters the fight against ISIS. No, I think it's Erdogan acts to secure ISIS supply lines so he can keep them alive. We were told today in this news hour that Turkey is now cutting back on the number of foreign fighters that are allowed to come through Turkey into northern Syria. Cutting back. Wouldn't we agree that there shouldn't be any when we've got these protestations of Turkey as an eternal ally? It shouldn't be any, should it? But now we're supposed to be thankful if Erdogan cuts back on the number of foreign fighters coming through. Very interesting is that Peter Bergen of CNN, this is somebody I clashed with 10 years ago about the nature of terrorism. Bergen said that he had talked recently to General Petraeus, our dear friend, General David Petraeus. And according to Bergen, Petraeus is now offering the estimate that the city of Mosul, right, the originally 2 million people, now maybe 1 million people, but Mosul, according to Petraeus, Mosul could fall during the term in office of Obama. So it means before January 20th of next year. Now, this is interesting. As most listeners now understand, that's not good enough. It's got to be essentially by November 1st, a couple of days into November, but it's got to be as soon as possible. So this reminds me of how manipulation works. For example, in the spring of 1941, there were people in the Nazi government in Berlin who felt that Stalin was going to hit them with a surprise attack. And Stalin did have a considerable buildup in the western part of the Soviet Union. So Stalin's approach to trying to muddy the waters was to say he allowed certain secret dispatches to be captured that said, yes, the Soviet Union is going to attack Germany, but in 1942, not in 1941. So if you believe that, then you're not going to be ready. So here it is. Petraeus says it could fall under Obama by January 20th. It's got to fall by November 1st. By November 1st, and let the word go out. It's got to be by November 1st for the obvious reason of avoiding the worst. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Make sure you check in at AmericanSystem.tv if you're interested in getting the updates that we work on all the time, getting those day by day. Usually comes out about 9 o'clock at night. So rather than listen to that tiresome pedant John Batchelor or people like that, you can get it here from me, and I hope you agree that's going to be much better. So AmericanSystem.tv. So now, Petraeus says that Mosul, the largest city controlled by ISIS, could fall, be liberated, I guess, be liberated would be our term, during the Obama presidency, January 20th. Well, again, this is no good. We've got to make up November, December, and the 20 days of January. So we got to move that up by about 80 days. And that should be the order going to U.S. forces, right? Again, Admiral David Glasgow Farragut knew in August of 1864 that he had to take Mobile Bay. As soon as he got those extra monitors, he went in there and he attacked those forts, and that was a big deal. Above all, William T. Sherman knew before Atlanta in August, September, that he had to do something. He had to impact the 1864 election, or the country itself could be lost to demagogues and slavocrats and treasonous operatives. So he made sure he captured Atlanta with that sweeping motion all the way around to the south and then back up the railroad. I would also add Philip Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, and Grant himself knew that they had to shut down Jubal Early out there in the Shenandoah, and they had to do that in October before the main voting of the 1864 election. So find some loyal officers, some officers who are not part of the Petraeus clique, because otherwise Trump takes the White House, and this is absolutely unacceptable. Now, another line from Bergen of CNN. He says the analysis is by some that the United States tried to oust Erdogan in the middle of July, right, the August 15th coup, and that the good relations between Russia and Turkey, which have improved markedly lately, there had been a gradual recovery from the Turkish shoot-down of that Russian plane back in 2015, but it had been a slow restoration of good relations. Now it's gone very fast. What has happened? One report says that Russia warned Erdogan that a coup was coming and that it was backed by the U.S. Possible on both counts, but not yet concluded. Biden has gone out of his way to belittle the Kurds. Biden is not a man of honor. Lunch Bucket Joe is essentially a windbag. He was a windbag in 1988 when he plagiarized speeches from Neil Kinnock of the British Labour Party about how his wife was the first person in her family in 1,000 generations to get to attend a university. Biden outdid himself this time saying, those Kurds, they better get out of there. We're not kidding. Did I mention we don't like those Kurds being where they are? They've got to do what we say. All of this bootlicking for Erdogan. So the Kurds have to stay west of the Euphrates, blah, blah, blah. This is not honorable. This is dishonorable. And you can see it. Also, the usual U.S. song and dance about human rights completely disappeared. So here's Erdogan. Erdogan is the biggest tyrant in the world, I think, at this point. I don't know, North Korea, China, I don't know. But Erdogan is a big tyrant. And he's arresting everybody. Tens of thousands of people have been thrown in jail. So the great Joe Biden, purveyor of human rights, says nothing about that. Zip. Nothing. So you can see how unsavory this whole episode is. But we will live with whatever it takes, but we want Raqqa and Mosul liberated, captured, ISIS kicked out, and ISIS smashed as a territorial entity. Smash them. Old Zawahiri, that veteran agent, the nominal head of Al-Qaeda, says, okay, ISIS, you blew it. You're going to lose your territory now. So you, ISIS, according to Zawahiri, should get ready to fight guerrilla warfare, especially in Iraq. All right. So there we have that. Now let's look again, pausing to note that if Al-Bab and that el-Karjes can be broken up, smashed, shut down, that essentially means it's like taking over Langley, Virginia, or taking over, again, the Oxford Circus. It used to be, anyway. We now have to look at the U.S. Election, and we've had all kinds of things happening. Trump has said now that he has abandoned his promise to deport the 12 million undocumented foreign workers. He has then departed from that. I think at this point nobody knows what Trump would, what he's professing changes from hour to hour. What he would do as president, of course, would be anybody's guess. I think I have an interesting little warning here, if I can find today's paper. Somebody in the Washington Post today says that the rule of being an analyst of Trump is that you can't believe anything that he says will be his position anytime soon. Here we go. Eugene Robinson, Washington Post. No one should cling to the illusion that a vote for Trump is a vote for any specific policy on any given issue. So he's whirling around, unprincipled, I'm afraid. Kellyanne Conway tells him one thing. We should remind ourselves that Trump, of course, is this kind of joint stock corporation. If you put, the pie of who's got the shares, you'd have to say that the Mercer family, through Conway and through Bannon, have a big share. You've also got Paul Ryan and Priebus of the Republican Party. They have a share. And we're also told that the Koch brothers, those, how about that, those scallywags, those Koch brothers are funneling money to Trump, and that the presence of Pence is interpreted by many, since Pence is a wheelhorse coming from this Americans for Prosperity, that is something that reflects the influence of the Koch brothers. So some of these people, obviously, they talk out of both sides of their mouths. So there we go. The other big question this week, in addition to this evasive action, right, these tortuous maneuvers by Trump, is to see the Hillary attack on the alternate right. And she actually mentioned Alex Jones as part of her analysis of this. And of course, the alternate right, if I could venture maybe to offer a kind of analysis, which we'll do here in just a minute. We come back on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Please check out AmericanSystem.tv. There you can get access to a new daily service of commentary, organizing, and other important themes. So it appears just about every day, Monday through Thursday at the moment. It'll become 5 days a week after Labor Day. That will be at 9 o'clock. Go to American System, 9 o'clock Eastern, p.m. Go to the AmericanSystem.tv. What is it? The alternate right? Where does it come from? Now, I would say right now this is a very bitter ideology. It is nihilistic. It's defeatist. It is anti-government, anti-science, irrationalistic. All kinds of problems here. A lot of these people were caught up in 9/11. And the time for some of them that was positive was that from about 2003 to 2007, the 9/11 Truth Movement provided an important contribution to the peace movement. In other words, my saying was that the intelligent part of the peace movement was the 9/11 Truth Movement. But of course, a lot of people interpreted this as mainly a technical problem, and they saw it mainly as looking backwards. I never did that. I thought that the question of, is there a rogue network inside the U.S. institutions that points towards control by Wall Street, by bankers, because that's typically how this works. You can certainly say, going back, the attempts to assassinate Roosevelt and the actual assassination of Roosevelt, the Kennedy assassination, the Bay of Pigs, all of these other catastrophes. That does point to the existence of this rogue network controlled by Wall Street. So it was important, I thought, to say, don't look at this as a technical problem. Look at it as a political problem. The difficulty with that was a lot of the people who came into this had been apolitical beforehand. So they were tossed into the post 9/11 world and essentially lost their way. They lost their way because they were, again, very much bound up with the technical side of it and unwilling or unable to come to political conclusions. You can read my book about that and see what I say. I have political conclusions. I say that this essentially, ultimately, the cui bono, cui prodest, who benefits on this is Wall Street. It's financier oligarchs. But as time went on, it became obvious that the big danger was a war against Iran. So I tried to reorient as much of this as I could to say not only is the Afghan war probably pointless, but the Iraq war is absolutely impossible and has to end. And don't compound it now with an attack on Iran, because that was the big issue coming especially from Cheney in 2006, 2007, and so on. So I would say the height of the 9/11 truth movement was reached around 2006 to 7. After that, unfortunately, a lot of people began turning to political candidates, some to Obama, but quite a few to Ron Paul and the Libertarians. And there's a very strange idea. In other words, the fact that there's a rogue network inside the U.S. government, an invisible government, if you will, that is no reason to become a reactionary like Ron Paul. And you'll remember his economic program was to cut $1 trillion out of the U.S. budget and to cut the food stamp budget by about 62%. So we'd get down to about 50 cents or 60 cents per person per meal. Pellagra Paul. But the idea that somehow a lot of people shifted from being concerned about 9/11 and again the possibility, the danger of a new war, that they shifted over into this other area of supporting a libertarian who was just, again, the most barbarous. In other words, the guy who was pushing the most extreme version of the Wall Street austerity genocide program against the American people. And then, of course, he failed. He betrayed them twice. Ron Paul said twice that he was not interested in reopening the question of 9/11. And then at that point, some of the same people who had recommended Ron Paul then started recommending Rand Paul, who turned out to be completely unprincipled and, similar to the father, but, less straightforward. So by 2012, there was obviously, as I've written about it, right, the whole Ron Paul 2012 presidential campaign, and you can read this in my book on Romney, right? That entire thing was an attempt to get Rand on the Romney ticket as a vice presidential candidate. So that was all over by the end of 2012. And then after that, there's a period of drift, and then there's this leap to support Trump, which makes absolutely no sense. In other words, it indicates a complete lack of principles and a complete lack of any positive judgment, because these are people, again, they're supposed to be so worried about police state tyranny and all that stuff. Along comes Trump and he says, there has to be surveillance. There has to be surveillance. So that's bad. So out of all that comes a terrific cynicism. And then it merges, this entire question merges into the general problem of the parties, right? Which is that the Republican Party combines these different, because by now these people are headed towards, by 2013, 2014, 2015. I noticed that the top libertarians wanted Romney to win, right? They had a stake in that, which I thought was quite fantastic when you look at it. But the Republican Party is what? It's got your evangelical Protestants, I guess. Your again, I call them the holy rollers, but the evangelicals, the religious people. Okay, you've got them. You've got these Archie bunkers. Again, this is sort of in the Northeast and maybe somewhat in California. You've got a bunch of neocons who have a pro-war agenda. You've got fiscal conservatives who are the legions of greed, and these are the country club people. But of course, you have Wall Street. In other words, setting the policies for all these people. When you say the donor elite of the Republican Party, well, That's got to be Wall Street. So again, this entire Republican cartel only holds together if you can keep duping the evangelicals and the Archie Bunkers. The Archie Bunkers are cynical and acidic. The evangelicals are, I guess, more from religious principles, but it's a very bigoted kind of religious principle. In other words, it does not embody the charity that that Christ talked about at all. So the weakness of the Republican Party is you've got to essentially have a program controlled by the moneyed interests, and this means union busting. It means free trade, sellouts, right? It means deregulation and tax cuts for rich people like the Koch brothers. And how do you keep the evangelicals, the Archie Bunkers, and the neocons? Well, the neocons, you give them a war every now and then. But then what is in this for the evangelicals and the Archie Bunkers? For some of them, it's respectability, right? Because a lot of these people exist in small town America, right? In the most recent party system, the sixth, we can just look at the composition of the Republican Party here for a minute, and you'll see what the problem is. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. on the afternoon of August 26th, 2016. So the breakup of the Republican Party. Let me just stress again what we're talking about. In the course of the history of the United States, starting in 1788, 1789, can start at different times, we have had 6 party systems that have been identified. And let's remind everybody so that there be no confusion. Here you're talking about the first one with Federalists and Jeffersonians, Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians, 1788 to 1828. Then we have the coming of Jacksonian democracy, Jacksonian disaster, I would call it. 1828 to 1860. That's dominated by these Democrats. The first one had been dominated by the Jeffersonians, Democrats also. Although in the first years of America, thank God, we had the benefit of Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and, above all, Alexander Hamilton, who knew what to do financially. So the first, again, 1788 to 1828. The second, 1828 to 1860. The third, Lincoln Republicans, 1860 to 1896. Thank God, once again, we were lucky. This was the really lucky point that we had the greatest man of the 19th century come forward and save our country and crush treason and secessionism. Then we have a fourth system, 1896 to 1932. This is now dominated by Republicans. These are no longer by any way, shape, or form Lincoln Republicans. They are Wall Street Republicans. So this is the cartels, the trusts, J.P. Morgan, and people like this. But then again, through some divine agency, maybe, 1932 to 1968, the New Deal cycle, the dominant force is now the New Deal Democrats of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and this goes all the way up to the point where Johnson offends the racists in the South by bringing in these civil rights laws and the loss of campuses and intellectuals by Johnson because of his foolish commitment to the Vietnam War. And then we've had this sixth party system from 1968 to, I think, 2008. I think it's looking more and more like that. It's one of the problems with this is these wheels grind very slowly. You got to keep watching. And that would be the Republican Southern strategy. And this would essentially say that the Republicans, after the deal between Nixon and Strom Thurmond, would become the racists in the South, and the Democrats were gradually driven out and took refuge in California and the Northeast and so forth. Now we're in the seventh party cycle. What is that going to be like? It should be that the demographic trends, right, the growing Latinos and Asian population, the aging of the Republican coalition and other forces should open the door to something much better. In other words, a better tomorrow should be here. And what we're trying to impress on people, you should use your vote and your voice in the 2016 election to accelerate, complete, consolidate, and improve this shift, the realignment in which I believe this time, and there's plenty of evidence, the Republican Party will become extinct. It will end. It will be gone as a national party. There may still be some people left in Washington who are Republicans, but they'll have essentially no power. And you have to figure this is something that goes slowly, because you have to get people on the Supreme Court, right? The existence of Antonin Scalia as a Supreme Court justice is unbelievable. It's barbarism. It's savagery. That could only happen as a result of the Republican Southern strategy and Nixon and these unprincipled Republicans and Reagan and so forth, right? So the Thomas and of course the late Scalia, those are people who they have no business being on the Supreme Court, not ever. And the only reason they're there is because of the tremendous degradation that was carried out during the Republican Southern strategy. So we want that end. And, of course, it did not leave the Democrats unscarred, right? One of the things people complain about is campaign money. Well, Tony Coelho was the House, the House Majority Whip or Minority Whip. No, Majority Whip in the early 1980s. And Coelho was somebody who said, look, Democrats should forget about unions and forget about these other organized groups, right? Forget about anybody who has meetings. Just get money and use that to buy TV. That was Tony Coelho, congressman, right? And that has now sunk in very, very deeply. So what we're seeing now is the decline of this Republican step. So it was, again, people who lived in the South, southern states, men, older men, suburban people, small towns, rural, evangelicals. And you can see these people, again, are passing gradually from the stage. And when I said, how did this hold together? Well, a lot of it is deference, right? In other words, that Republicans in small towns, and you can see it, pay deference to their betters. Who are their betters? People who have more money. This is unbelievable, but this is still a widespread mentality. In the Republican Party today, you can see any number of structural conflicts. For example, we just talked about money. The Koch brothers are sending money to House races and Senate races. The Mercers, and of course the Koch brothers are sending some money, I'm sure, to the Trump campaign. Or better yet, the Koch brothers are helping with get out the vote efforts that will help Trump. But then on the other side, you got the Mercers who say the opposite. They say, I don't care about these congressional races. As a matter of fact, the Mercers and Breitbart and Bannon tried to get Ryan defeated, the Speaker of the House, in his primary. They wanted him primary. They wanted him to go the way of the former majority leader Eric Cantor in Virginia, who's now been replaced by the nonentity Brat, the sort of garden variety reactionary. So there is a party that's tearing itself apart, and we'll go through over the coming weeks a lot of the aspects of this. The transition can be slow. It takes a while to get the Supreme Court rectified, right? Roosevelt had that problem after he'd been in office for 4 years. The Democrats have a problem. They're not in all 50 states. And we can go through a whole series of other problems that are going to take quite a while. Now, on the Democrat side, you have to understand what that is. We've said before, the Republicans are an ideological party. ideological parties need, if they can't deliver the utopia, or even if they try to, the Republicans are an ideological party and they need an increasing dose of more and more extreme ideology. It's a little bit like the heroin habit, right? The dose has to be increased to get the same psychological effect. So that's what's happening with the Republicans. You can say that the Trump candidacy takes and concentrates in itself, in extremely concentrated doses, all of the essence of the Republican Party of the last 20 or 30 years. It's just an escalation in the amount. And remember what that is: guns, God, gays, abortion, immigration, and race. And the idea that if you're a Republican, you got to be pro-gun and you got to want to deport every immigrant, which is, of course, this is a crazy combination. Back in a minute. Back to World Crisis Radio. So, reminding you to go check out The American System at americansystem.tv and hopefully become part of that audience. This would be a great thing, and I would much appreciate it, needless to say, but it's a good value, and I urge you to do it. The Republican Southern Strategy, right? This stuff was written by Kevin Phillips, the emerging Republican majority, 1968 or thereabouts, and that was that coalition that I went through before. Notice that it corresponds with economic decline. After 1971, Nixon destroyed the Roosevelt New Deal monetary system. 1987, we have the Reagan bubble going down in flames. In 2000, we've got the dot-com bubble, and then we've got the derivatives bubble of 2008. So that's a bad time. It's a time of union retreat and declining standards of living. This is the most important thing. The Republican Southern strategy is a low-wage strategy. 1968 to 08, the standard of living of America falls by between 1/2 and 2/3. And these are the facts. And these poor people you see supporting Trump are the victims of all that, but they also suffer the tension of not knowing it and not knowing why. In other words, when they go home, their wife still says, why can't you get us a decent standard of living? And few are the workers who can say, well, this is essentially a consequence of Nixon wrecking the Bretton Woods fixed parity and gold convertibility system on August 15th, 1971, compounded by the Reagan bubble, the dot-com bubble, and the rehabilitation of derivatives that then exploded in 2008. That's why, dear. No, people don't get it. They're not aware. So they're acting out the rage, right? They don't know why. That's the worst kind of rage, is you're enraged and you don't know why. So that's that. Now, on the Democratic side, the Democratic Party has also been profoundly vitiated by this entire process. In the New Deal, the Democratic domination was built on the dominance of economic factors. Yes, indeedy. The things that I call mass traction economic demands. That's the basis of rational politics. Is it a government that delivers the goods, rising standards of living, full employment, longevity, cultural improvement, upward mobility, and so forth? That was the New Deal Democratic Party. What are you going to get? Social Security Act with a minimum wage, with an old age pension, with unemployment insurance. You're going to get the Wages and Hours Act. You're going to get child labor laws put in. You're going to get a relief from fraudulent and abusive foreclosures, and on and on. And eventually you're going to get full employment before the war, but full employment by about mid-1941. And again, they'll say, well, that's military spending. So this is like saying the Depression, a Republican will tell you, a Depression can't be defeated by government spending. It has to be defeated by government spending. In other words, it can't be done by a stimulus plan, but it can be done by a military buildup. Well, what you're doing, you can combine these benefits The Democratic Party now has de-emphasized economic issues, or at least they've tried to as much as they can. The Democratic Party today says to you, the issue is identity politics. We've got to make sure that all of the different ethnic, religious groups in U.S. society, that they get represented. In other words, they've got to be faces they can look at and say, that looks like me, or here's somebody who thinks like me. This has essentially made it harder to carry out the party realignment, especially with Obama being in the White House and being, I think, significantly invested in the identity politics group of the Democratic Party. You can see why that's an issue. So maybe let's not go through all the groups in the Democratic Party right now, but I think it's enough to say that you know a lot of them, right? In other words, blacks, Latinos, you've got unions. I hate to mention them, but they count for almost nothing. The women's organizations, the trial lawyers, and so forth, right? I'm not giving an exhaustive list, but we'll go through the list at various points. Right now, again, the problem is, what can you do in the course of this presidential election that will accelerate the breakup of the Republican Party and at the same time help the Democrats to win as big as possible? In other words, a straight Democratic ticket all the way. Is this because the Democrats are so wonderful and competent? No, it doesn't mean that. But what it means is you want the Democrats to go into 2017 as big and bloated and overstuffed as they can be. And why? Because you want to prepare the breakup of the Republican Party into two parts. One will be the pro-Wall Street Democrats, right, which is pretty much Hillary, Schumer, the people you see, right, Feinstein, Durbin, this group, Biden. That's the pro-Wall Street Democrats. But now you do have this other group, and this other group is unreliable, weak, it's confused, it's disoriented, all these things you say. Bernie, Elizabeth Sanders, Marcy Kaptur, people like that, DeFazio, there's a group in the House, right? The Progressive Caucus, Keith Ellison, and on and on. So, fine. And those two should split because those are fundamentally different parties. In other words, one is anti-labor, pro-Wall Street, pro-speculator. You got to see where the hedge fund hyenas gravitate, where the zombie bankers gravitate. So now, what is Mrs. Clinton doing? The speech in Nevada I think it's a good example. This is the one where she talks about Alex Jones. She talks about the Republican Party as a group of paranoids. She talks about the alt-right. And again, I think the alt-right is significantly what's left over after that terrible process of disillusionment, embitterment, disorientation, and just negativity at every conceivable level. Mrs. Clinton is trying to win as big as she can by overloading the right wing of the Democratic Party because she thinks that's going to help her to balance. And it won't. At least if we do our job, it won't. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Back to World Crisis Radio. So Mrs. Clinton would like to load up the right wing of the Democratic Party with more of these suburban Philadelphia security moms and soccer moms. And both these, again, are Republican women, basically. Liberal Republican women. Get those. It's great. It is important to secure the Democratic Party remaining in power. Because if you let the Republicans get into power, and it doesn't really matter who, but obviously with the current candidate, what you're going to get is that permanent austerity dictatorship I talked about, right? And we got to remember what the Republican regime would actually do with that Congress, right, with people like Mitch McConnell, tool of the Koch brothers, with Ryan, this guy who comes out of the ideological land of the John Birch Society, and the rest of them, what they would do, I'm keeping up my list, right? They would privatize the Veterans Administration, and that would be a cash cow for some unscrupulous gang. They would privatize the U.S. Postal Service to get that pot of money in the middle of that. They would privatize Social Security so Wall Street would get the commissions, and they would privatize, again, Medicare and the rest of it. So they would strip you of your rights. Oh, here, for the black community, right? Trump is asking, what do you have to lose? Oh, we can tell you what you have to lose. The short answer is, of course, everything. There's also a matter of dignity, self-respect, that you can't be talked to. And he basically says, you guys are destitute, so why not me, even though I'm obviously very dangerous? Look, you're going to, and I have to thank Jesse Jackson, right? Jesse Jackson has a little program every week that he does on cable TV, and he's often a very, very sane voice. So what do you have to lose? First of all, your right to vote, because the Republicans would take that away. If you have a union and you want to keep that, you're going to lose it. How about your pension under Social Security? How about your rights under Medicare, right? If they privatize that, then the risk shifts to you and your own, right? And they'll say, here's a $500 voucher. Go and do whatever you can with it. Medicaid, and especially Medicaid in the context of Obamacare. They'll get rid of that. And the Veterans Administration and so forth. That's what you have to lose. Now, again, we think the answer to this is for the Democratic Party to focus more on economic demands and leave aside some of the identity politics demands, or somehow merge those into actual economic demands. This is one of the great weaknesses of a group like Black Lives Matter, because they seem to say there should be no economic demands, and rather you should focus everything on the idea of racism or the psychology of racism, as if this could be divorced from institutions and economic factors. I think that's where Jesse Jackson sounds a whole lot more realistic, because he's saying, you have to have job program, housing program, health program, school program, urban mass transit, and so on down the line. I think that makes a great deal of sense. Now, I would hope to get to some of the previous examples of these party realignments, but I think we'll leave it there. Now, let's look at Bernie Sanders, okay? Because we're the Tax Wall Street Party, but we're not sectarian, and we're interested in dialogue with other groups. Now, on Wednesday night, the Bernie Sanders team launched a new organization called Our Revolution. And this was with a speech by Bernie Sanders, which I listened to very carefully, and I'd like to discuss it with you a little bit right now. Before we go any further, I have to say that the glaring weakness of the entire evening is there's nothing on foreign policy, nothing. And this group, I submit this group, the Our Revolution group, ought by rights to say we couldn't prevail against Hillary Clinton, or we didn't. They could have, but they didn't. We'll talk about that too. They could say, well, one of the things we've learned is that we have to have a vigilance and we have to organize a way to box in Hillary Clinton and make sure that she's not able to start these wars, because she's going to be under tremendous pressure from neocons who are joining the Democrats and from her own self, right? This feminist problem that she has, that she feels that if she's going to be the first female president, she's going to have to be a warmonger to prove that she's not a softie, because otherwise they'll call her a softie, and they will. But that's exactly what weakness means. So here's what they're going to do. We are told that the Our Revolution group is going to have champions. The champions, I don't know. That doesn't seem to coexist very well with their motto from Bernie, that change comes from the bottom up, never, never, never from the top down. look, I don't know what this means. You got to get change any way you can. It's not how you get it, it's do you get it? And up to now, it has not been gotten. I also have to point out the background here is redolent of Occupy Wall Street. Now, look, we got to be realistic. Occupy Wall Street was a colossal failure. It got 0 candidates elected. You want to work politically in the United States, you need to get public office. If you have some other plan, let's hear it, right? Whatever it is. But normally it's this. The Tea Party was able to get 80 representatives, members of Congress put in, 10 senators, 10 governors, whatever it was. But our wonderful friends here from Occupy Wall Street, 0, nothing. Well, I remember having a debate with a supporter of Occupy Wall Street, OWS, in 2012, I guess, once it was all over. And this guy argued, yeah, it's true. We didn't get anybody elected. We couldn't get any issue enacted. In other words, you could have said, we want a $15 minimum wage, nationwide, federal. We want it now. Congress, pass it now or we're coming to you. Or anything like that. They just couldn't make up their minds to do anything like this, right? Because remember, a lot of these people are anarchists. A lot of these people are anthropologists, meaning they're counterinsurgency operatives on the Occupy Wall Street side. So they failed. But some of them said, we have changed the national conversation. And I'm afraid this term from Occupy Wall Street was introduced by Bernie Sanders himself. He said, well, we didn't win, but we got the majority of people below 45 in virtually every state, Black, Hispanic, Native American, and so forth. But we changed the conversation and we redefined the vision of the country and the political process. This is totally inadequate. This is the language of weakness. It is the language of defeat. It's the language of impotence, and I'm very sorry. The essence of politics is either get elected or at least win your demands. Occupy Wall Street says there should be no demands because if you win them, then you're going to be co-opted. This is beyond all belief. So changing the conversation, my God, the conversation changes all the time. It goes from, I think we said, from Honey Boo Boo to Cher to Lady Gaga to Miley Cyrus to the World Series to football. The national conversation is always changing, and that is just not enough. It won't work. It will not do. We need more. Back in a minute. Welcome to World Crisis Radio. Let's try to wrap up as much as we can of the Bernie Sanders Our Revolution group. They want to have between 50 and 100 candidates. This is very positive. A candidates movement. That makes a lot of sense. And they also want to intervene on certain ballot measures. Now, the people that they want to support as candidates range from people that are more or less locally known, like Jamie Raskin here in the D.C. suburbs, Raul Grijalva, Tulsi Gabbard, Keith Ellison. They want to support these people generally for Congress. Zephyr Teachout they want for Congress. Well, we know her, but still, a Congress filled with Zephyr Teachouts, if you could get a faction, that would be worth something. Russ Feingold for Senate in Wisconsin. That's fine. Again, the big thing is what's the program? What else we have here? Oh, in terms of now the ballot propositions, the issue interventions, overturn Citizens United, automatic registration by 18-year-olds, fine. Alaska Measure 1, they say is something that's going to add 50,000 voters to the voter rolls. I'm not sure what that is. It might be registration. It might be something like McAuliffe has. He wants to put 200,000 felons who have served their time and they're all done and they're out and they paid their debts to society. They should get the right to vote. California Proposition 61 is that the California Medi-Cal, right, the Medicaid of California, will not pay a higher price on prescriptions than what the Veterans Administration pays. Now, we talked about them before, right? Trump would, I think, because the VA, Veterans Administration, is a pack, so they get decent prices, whereas Medicare is not able to haggle. Why not? Because the reactionary Republicans have kept that in place. In Washington State, there is a ballot initiative to overturn Citizens United as far as the state goes. In Colorado, there is a ballot question to establish a single payer, and Medicare or Medicaid for all comes to mind, to establish that in Colorado. And they also want to have some ballot initiatives in favor of Native Americans, and I'm sure those are overdue and fully justified. However, the problem is, again, there's nothing about policy. There's nothing really about the Federal Reserve that I can see. There were protests at the Federal Reserve. This is not our revolution anymore, but there's a group called the Fed Revolution, and their program is very weak, kind of diversity oriented. It focuses mainly on the identity politics of the Federal Reserve Board. But it doesn't change the fact that it doesn't help you if they're still finance oligarchs. It doesn't matter what color they are. But the Fed Up Coalition says if you think you should raise interest rates right now, you're crazy, because if you raise interest rates, you're going to slow down on job creation. Right? The Federal Reserve, Yellen today said that the U.S. has reached maximum employment. Yeah, go to Harlem and tell us that. Go to South Central Los Angeles. Go over to the Cabrini Greens in Chicago and tell us that we have maximum employment. So the black community is getting shafted by the Federal Reserve Board because they say we're going to take away the punch bowl now. We're going to, even in this realm of the existing credit system, they say we're going to start raising interest rates because the Federal Reserve, as Wright Patman always observed, congressman from Texas, was they don't want full employment because full employment then begins to drive up wages, and they are there to serve the interests of the parasitical business community. So they don't do that. Now, the background for the Bernie group, Our Revolution, and they have a list, right? You go to their website, there you can see the people they're supporting, is that there had been a group saying they hate this guy Jeff Weaver, who's an old friend and constant associate of Bernie Sanders. They wanted to say no big money contributions. That's absurd. If somebody offers you a larger contribution, you take it and then show us your integrity and your morality by continuing to do what you were doing and not being bought. Taking money and being bought are not the same thing. And they also said, we don't want to have advertising in newspapers or television. That's passé. We want digital only. This is absurd. Find a balance. Find a way to split it for the greatest effect. In other words, what you're running into is mental contagion. The anarchists, the profit-oriented counterinsurgency people who took over so much of the Occupy Wall Street. They also have some unionists, though. They do. They have Larry Cohen of the Communications Workers of America. They have some others. And again, I think they are too focused. It's the problem that Bernie had, right? The $27. Yeah, $27 is great, but what does that do for anybody? Does that help a starving family? Does that prevent a foreclosure? Does that get you in to see a doctor, right? All the stuff about process, clean politics, good government. These are the earmarks of somebody who has been too long among the fussy, prissy independents of this world. The other question, Bernie says he's a socialist. He is a socialist. We won't go through the various verbal pyrotechnics, but Bernie's not he's a social democrat, and he has no class consciousness, because when he says we want Medicare for all, The question with that is, who's going to pay for it? Will it be Wall Street finance oligarchs, zombie bankers, hedge fund hyenas, parasites of all kinds, predators? Is it going to be done through taxing the class of people who created the 2008 crisis, or is it going to be working people? Same thing with where's the money coming from? You've got to specify, because otherwise Joe Sixpack thinks you're going to increase his taxes. And with some of these people, that seems to be what they would want. So you've got to spell it out, saying this comes exclusively from bankers, financiers, parasites, and other enemies of the public interest. So remember, mass traction economic demands, not process. Process, yeah, once in a while you can say, we're clean, we've been audited. There's also this anti-fossil fuel emphasis. I'm afraid that is, it's very dubious. First of all, we don't know if those are fossil fuels, right? The Russian or Soviet abiotic oil thesis is always out there. What are you going to do, Bernie? Is it going to be a carbon tax? Is it going to be tax cap and trade? I think that means that you're going to increase the burden on the lower incomes. In other words, you're going to be blinded by this specter of global warming. Well, global warming can be real enough, but the idea that somehow reducing carbon or raising the prices of carbon, that I think is the absurdity. And that's going to lead you to attack precisely the people you have to organize. You're going to go to Joe Sixpack and say, guess what? We're going to increase the price of gasoline and you're going to pay. And of course, in a world where China is filling the skies with, storm clouds of smoke. I would also say there's not enough political education. In other words, the whole Bernie campaign introduced people to the existence of certain topics, but you've got to have a commitment to political education. Bernie says, and this is an important point, he wants economic justice, social justice, environmental justice, and racial justice. Here's the problem with justice. When you say justice, this sounds like Aristotle. And when Aristotle says judgment, Aristotle means distributive justice, which assumes that there is a sufficiency of material goods and they're distributed badly, right? Some people have too much income inequality. This is wrong. This is not the condition of humanity. There is not enough goods. Distribution is important and it will follow. But before they can be distributed, they've got to be produced. So productive justice should come first. But when you say justice, economic justice, nobody understands that. In other words, if you want production, you've got to talk about production. So who pays? Which class pays? Financiers or working people? Students or zombie bankers? Get the idea? In those limits, I mean, we'll certainly keep in touch with the Our Revolution group. And we congratulate Bernie Sanders for setting it up. And we would urge those millennials to get real.